Station 51, engine 27, engine 32, truck 105.
You're listening to The Fire Break with Steve Wolf.
Welcome back to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technology for wildfire suppression, containment, control, and all the other things that we need to do when wildfires get started if we don't want to. Have them keep doing what they would do if we didn't stop them from doing that. And what are they going to do? Who knows? Well, Phil Cunningham has a pretty good idea about that because Phil is in charge of wildfire modeling at First Street, which is a B Corp now, having evolved from the nonprofit sector into the, well, hopefully profitable sector. Phil, welcome to The Fire Break. How are you today?
Yes, I'm well. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm so glad we finally catch up together.
Yeah.
Playing tag for a little bit. So tell me two things. First of all, what's the mission at First Street overall? And then how does your work in the wildfire component fit into that?
Okay, very good. So First Street is a company that's dedicated, and its mission is essentially climate risk financial modeling. So we provide data and tools for the financial industry, for the insurance industry, and also for individuals as part of we have a consumer product, a consumer subscription product that people can purchase a subscription and check out their risk for things like flood, wildfire, air quality, heat and cold, drought, and wind. So lots of, hazards, perils that can have an impact on the value of a property or the risk of the property to, damage. And some of the things that we think about to financial risk, what's the likelihood, or can we figure out things like the likelihood of a mortgage default in the future because of it's more of an issue for flood than for fire, because flood insurance is a little different. Is a little different. So mortgage defaults because of flood are an issue or a problem, and so that's one thing that we help government agencies and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and then financial lenders, mortgage companies, et cetera, as well as then the insurance sector, which are more interested in actual potential loss, damage and loss, and then future claims. And that's obviously a key part of where wildfire comes in.
Right.
And in terms of what I do as part of I'm the director of wildfire modeling here, and we have a small group of wildfire experts that we look at trying to model, trying to understand the property level risk.
Okay.
Parcel level. So, with our consumer product, you can log in and enter an address, and it will give you all of your risk factor scores for flood, fire, et cetera. But in fire, obviously, we care about things like the return period, the burn probability. What's the likelihood that your property is going to face a fire this year? What's the likely intensity? What sort of is? And we use flame length as a metric because it's something that most people understand. But then also we use climate models to project into the future and use the future climate predictions to then run our risk model again and see how our risk might change in 15 years, 30 years, and even farther out than that. And so that's essentially what we do. We're trying to provide a service to a fairly broad range of customers to help them understand not just their current risk to fire, but how that risk to fire might change in the future.
Okay, and so as the conditions change and go from the experienced and the imagined off up into the yet to be experienced, soon being experienced, and often
Right.
unimagined,
Right.
right? Things really change. I'm looking at the Citicorp building behind you, which was a great example of that, right? When they built the Citicorp building, they said, well, we have to build to 90-mile-an-hour winds because that's the most that has happened here. And then they did some research and say, actually, there have been 110-mile-an-hour winds here, and they had to redesign and reweight
Right.
the entire structure because they had
Well,
anticipated what the future might look like. And so that's
especially since, while, wind damage tends to go to the fourth power, I think, of the wind. So
yeah.
just going from 90 to 100, and you take that to the fourth power, that's a pretty big,
Right.
significant change. So yeah.
Right, and it's not something that's slow and that
Right.
the change is happening or the damage happens gradually over time, like to my face. Right, this is more like the incident happens and the next day everything's scattered all over the floor.
Right. Indeed.
Yeah. So when you're looking at the financial impact of wildfire, you're looking out into the future. You're trying to predict, what the climate's going to look like and how that's going to impact the frequency and severity and damage load of fires.
Yep.
And I imagine then this data is pretty useful not only to people doing financial planning, but people who are in the emergency response sector, et cetera.
Sure.
Or even people who are thinking, I'm tired of living, in Manhattan or Brooklyn, where you are, and I'd like to move somewhere. Where's the climate going to be acceptable?
Absolutely.
Right.
That's absolutely right. And we have a team here of economists as well who are experts in analyzing sort of historical financial information and social demographics and property statistics. And there is such a thing as climate migration. It's a definable and quantifiable thing, and it's certainly something that people are thinking about.
For sure.
Do I still want to live where I'm at risk of being flooded from either sort of flash floods or hurricane, or do I still want to live in parts of California where my risk is ridiculously high, and we can look out of our back window and see dense brush that hasn't been cleared, and it's only then a matter of time and a little bit of luck then obviously as to when is that going to burn and how is that going to impact the property. And but yeah, these are definitely things we do. We think about migration patterns that are specific to people who are interested in climate. One of our tool is used by Zillow, for example. So our data is used by Zillow. So when you go onto Zillow and you're looking for a new rental property or a new property to buy, every property in the US at least is, when you search on Zillow, has risk factors for flood and wind and fire and heat and cold. And you can map them and sort of try and have a sense of what are the places what can you live with? Is it okay? I don't mind being hot, but I really don't want to deal with wildfire. Or I'm comfortable protecting my home from wildfire and taking that responsibility on myself, but I really don't want to deal with potential flooding or things like that. So you can make those assessments as well.
So you can do that essentially this heat map.
Yes.
Of climate risk, no pun intended,
Exactly.
on the heat map.
Exactly. And then look into the future and say, well, what's that likely? How is that likely to change? And again, this is why it's relevant sort of from the financial industry is sort of 30 years is a relevant, obviously, time period for mortgages and things, and sort of and so banks and lenders that are trying to quantify their risk, it's a useful tool for them. And we've, as far as fire risk is concerned, I think there are a lot of potential, users and interest in not just emergency management, obviously, but also, people who are in the sort of these peripheral businesses around wildfire. So home hardening, wildfire mitigation and prevention specialists. There's lots of, adjacent industry, if you like. So
Right.
I think that's a valuable thing to do. And obviously it's not an easy thing to do. Wildfire is a complicated beast. And, and so we, will accept that it's a difficult problem to handle. And I think, we obviously feel confident and we feel good about our model, and we think it's an industry leading model. And we're excited to expand. We're taking the product from, for the moment, it's US, and we just released global hazard models, and obviously slightly coarser resolution and slightly sort of different methods that allow us to do global. But yeah, we have global fire models, global wind, and soon global flood. And so these are things that, at the moment, that's an enterprise product. So that's, less of a consumer individual product and more on the enterprise commercial side. But that's also very valuable. And clearly there are places that the risk is dramatically increasing to fire, flood, heat, what have you.
Hurricane. Yeah.
Hurricanes, exactly.
Right. So I imagine if there's a hurricane in the ocean, like we're looking at one materializing right now, then that affects shipping, transit times for getting fossil fuels from the Middle East here. All right. And increases the likelihood that ships will end up on the bottom of the ocean instead of at port. And then that's going to impact the price of gasoline next week. And so all the financial ripple models.
Right, exactly. And then obviously the obvious factors of, as if it is a landfalling hurricane, then there's, wind and storm surge and flood, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's...
At least it won't be a wildfire, because
at least it
wildfires and
won't be
hurricanes tend to not travel in the same circles. So there's the good news. So tell me about the model itself. You said that the models for wildfire were complex, and there's a tendency that the further we are from something, the more mysterious it is.
Yeah.
And as we get close to it and we get more knowledge about it and we study it and get up close and personal with it, the complexities start to reveal themselves.
Right.
And so tell me about how that experience has been for you, going from, I heard about wildfires when I was a kid, to now, I'm very familiar with exactly what the drivers are and the maneuvers are. So
it's a long story, Steve. It's a long story. I'll try and keep it short. So by education, I'm actually a meteorologist. My degrees are in atmospheric science, and when I finished my PhD, I went to Florida State University in Tallahassee, and I was a professor of meteorology at FSU. And I was working on more traditional meteorology type problems. I was looking at how the jet stream behaves and how storm systems work. But I was always been very interested in fundamentally in the physics of fluids and how
Yeah.
how the atmosphere works, how the ocean
Right.
works. And even more than that, I've always been interested in vortices. So
Okay.
vortices have always fascinated me. So whether it's a tornado or a big vortex, a hurricane, which is a fascinating thing, or down to dust devils or small fire whirls, then up to big fire tornadoes. These are things that I was always interested in. So my meteorology work was really focused around how different types of vortices behave, and there are vortices everywhere of all different scales, and that's what I was really doing. And then I think purely sort of out of chance, I suppose, serendipity, I came across some work that people I knew were doing, people at NCAR actually in Boulder, and I thought, wow, that's cool. I would love to do that. And as a professor, I was sort of sitting there thinking, well, there's nothing I can do that. There's nobody. I don't really have a boss as a professor. I mean, I teach my classes, I do, my things, but nobody's telling me what I should be studying. So I'm like, why shouldn't I study that? I'm like, okay, I'm going to study wildfires. And so I got connected with a whole range of people and tried to sort of get my feet wet. I met Janice Cohen at NCAR, for example, and then Rod Lynn at Los Alamos National Lab. And then I was lucky to be connected at FSU with some quite influential computational scientists. So, we had good computational facilities there. So I was lucky that when I say I wanted to do something, I was actually, all the pieces were sort of there to let me do it. And so I started working, and my real interest was like, how do I understand these firewalls, these vortices, and all these sort of crazy things that happen in fires? And I started building these very complex coupled atmosphere fire models. And so they do this at NCAR, they do this at Los Alamos National Lab, they do this at NIST. And there are people more so now than back then. We're talking now, this is the early 2000s when I started working on this. So I started really getting into the physics of fire, the physics of the problem, and how can I incorporate fire combustion in an atmospheric model so I can sort of understand, well, I have a fire here and it's putting a huge amount of heat into the atmosphere. What's going on? How is that changing the atmosphere? And then thinking about, there are lots of, anybody who's been out on a fire will use phrases like, well, the fire creates its own wind. And, this is a plume-driven fire. This is a wind-driven fire. All these things that are quite sort of commonly discussed in the fire community, but how does it actually work? Because from a science perspective,
Yes.
from a physics perspective, I really wanted to understand, well, what is actually going on? What's doing what to what? Like, okay, I have fire and it's creating a lot of buoyancy. It's making firewalls. But how does that actually? So this was how I started.
Okay.
And I did that for several years. And for a while, then I was at Los Alamos, where we were working with the big computers, with the big models, looking at how fires spread and looking at the sort of fundamental physical properties of, is it convective heat transfer versus radiative heat transfer? Is it, what is the wind actually doing? What's the turbulence in the wind doing? And it's obviously turbulence in general is an incredibly complicated problem, but you add fire, then you have a chemical reaction in addition to your turbulence. But there are things that you can understand and things that you can, help use the models, even those very complex models. You can say, well, this is a good tool to test things. This is a good tool it's like a virtual real sort of scale lab. We have, like at the fire lab in Missoula, Mark Finney has like his fire tunnel, and he can do experiments there. But it's much harder to go out into the field and say, well, what would happen if the wind was this? And what would happen if the temperature was that? Or what would happen? You can ask these hypothetical scenarios and get some understanding of how fire works. And one of the things, again, my interest in vortices and the sort of extreme fire behavior, sort of a point along the way, I had visited a colleague of mine in Australia not long after the Canberra fire in 2003, which caused a lot of damage, and there was a big fire tornado. And so I spent, a very pleasant several months in Melbourne with my colleague, and we tried to understand how pyroconvection works, pyrocumulonimbus, pyrotornadoes. Can we simulate those with models? And these are the sort of things that, this is sort of my journey.
Yeah.
And I think sort of at some point along the way, I kind of stopped. And about just because of family sort of issues, we'd like to, I sort of wanted to move a bit. And so I took a bit of a hiatus from fire for a bit, and I was working in industry and consulting, still doing model stuff, but thinking about oil spills, explosions in oil wells and things like that. And so I had some fun experience, but then I missed wildfire, as we always do when we get out of wildfire. We kind of get sucked back in. It's like they pull me back in again. And so several years ago, I then came back to the US and in Boston, and I've been working since then on what I would call wildfire risk models. And these are a little different than the complex coupled physics-based models, where you're really trying to understand the three-dimensional and time behavior of how fire is interacting very specifically with the atmosphere. In the wildfire risk world, we're much more interested in statistics. Things like, well, what's the likely return period of damaging fire in Southern California? What's the likely intensity? What's the sort of, or the maximum flame rate? What sort of parameters, what can we assign in terms of frequency, magnitude, maybe size of the fire as well? All these sort of statistical properties that we need to, communicate to the public in terms of like, well, what is my actual risk of a wildfire? I live in California, but am I actually at high risk or less so? And so to do that, these big coupled fire atmosphere models can take several days to run on, 1,000 processor supercomputer. That's not very helpful. Right. For the risk, because the risk is, again, you're thinking of statistics. So you really kind of want to have this big catalog of hypothetical fires. Okay, these are millions and millions of fires that could exist at some point, depending on, the conditions. And so the way we work with these wildfire risk models is we scale back the fire behavior model quite a lot and go back to Rothermel-based spread equations and landscape spread models like Farsight, or we use Elmfire, but it's very similar to Farsight. These are all this. In Canada, there's Prometheus, I think. I forget the names of these things. But we use these models, and they're great because they run really quite quickly. You give some input, you fuels input and weather input and et cetera, and you can get a footprint, simulate a fire where you get a footprint and an intensity at the resolution, at the scale that you're interested in, and you can run those models really quite quickly. It's like 10, 20 seconds for any given fire. So that allows us to run tens of millions of events. So we have, a statistically meaningful answer. And so we take the fuels data, the 30-meter fuels data from Landfire, the satellite-derived fuels in the at the moment in the standard Scottenbergen sort of format, but also with canopy variables. So we take the fuels data. We take historical weather. We look at, hypothetically, we take sort of 10 years of historical weather hourly. So we have this very long sort of record of weather. So there's an hourly for 10 years, however many records that is. And essentially we just say, okay, well, what's the probability of an ignition at this point? So we look at historical data. We look at the fire occurrence database, the FOD. We look at the monitoring trends in burn severity database. And we take those historical fires and we kind of create a probability map, a likelihood of ignition. So where are you more likely to have fires? So a heat map of ignitions.
Right.
And we just say, oh, I want 10 million fires, and we'll sort of throw darts at the ignition map and put that into our spread model. And we just do this millions and millions of times all over, in this case, all over the US. And
Right.
then we can build up this big database of tens of millions of fires and just sort of plop them all together and average them and say, okay, well, based on this approach in Southern California, we explore in this particular area, we do this at 30-meter resolution. So there's our maps are, the pixels are 30 meters. And at that point, now we have our wildfire risk map. And we have, these models have embers. So we have spotting and ember ignition as well. So that's the hazard part. And
Right.
we take that. So your probability of being in a fire and the likely intensity, the likely flame length, and we put that into a vulnerability, like a damage model.
Right.
And so that essentially is saying, well, okay, if this, the idea that, well, okay, if the fire is approaching my house, but the flame is less than a foot, the likelihood of my house, completely being lost is really very small. But if the flames are 30 feet, 40 feet, and I've got a ton of embers, then the likelihood of damage to my house dramatically increases. And that damage function is quite binary. It's like we see this obviously post-fire quite frequently. There are houses that are completely destroyed next to houses that might have a little more than some smoke damage. And so there's a lot of what we would call stochasticity, a lot of randomness in the model, but overall we sort of hope that we simulate enough fires that we're sort of covering all of those bases, capturing where the risk is much higher versus where the risk is much lower. And then those can go on. The damage, you can keep going down that line to say, well, okay, if the house is completely destroyed, then if you're thinking about insurance, then there's a dollar value attached to that. There's a total replacement value from an insurance perspective. If you're thinking about other financial sort of instruments, things, it can be a little sort of bit more complicated perhaps, but in general, you can once
Space.
you've sort of got a flame length, then you can, there's some error bounds on this, obviously. There's some uncertainty, and we try to quantify the uncertainty as best we can. But once you get these intensities, then you can kind of attach dollar amounts to this, and then you can simulate every fire that you simulate. You can say, well, okay, I'm doing something a little bit more sophisticated than just saying, if the house is inside the footprint, then it's lost, which we all know is it's that never happens. It's, the intensity varies a lot across the fire, and there's not even generally sort of a rule of thumb like 10% of properties or 20. It can be very variable, right? So that's where the models come in particularly useful, because they're using the fuels as good as good and as accurate as we can, but we're using the fuels that in principle are in the vicinity of the property. So we have a good sense of whether, okay, well, this house is next door to a field of short grass. So the likelihood is that it's going to be mostly smaller flames. But this house is in the middle of, montane conifer forest at altitude, and the likelihood is that the maximum flame length is going to be much higher. So we can map those things out, and this is how we try and get from just sort of basic principles of using historical data on fire activity and weather, and use these even relatively simple models, like sort of Rothermel-based models. We can use those to then kind of quantify losses and then financial impacts as well. So it's sort of a whole workflow from the science team to a data team to an exposure to an implications team, and then what's that, so we have this whole sort of pipeline for the climate risk. And fire is unique in the sense that humans play a big role in fire, right? Humans start fires, we put out fires, we can modify the fire environment while it's happening. Ideally, we would modify the fire environment before it happens to prevent it from happening, but that's a different story. But one of the nice things then about these risk models is that they can highlight places that are particularly high risk that you can then examine and say, well, okay, the First Street model says that my house has a risk of 9 out of 10. It's like extreme risk. So what can you actually do about it? And that there's sort of some informational, sort of educational purpose to that as well. And I hope that these things, I'm pretty big on personal homeowner responsibility as well as, and clear your brush if you can. It's sort of your responsibility as a homeowner to do all the things that you are physically able to do or could possibly do under sensible circumstances, right? Because as you well know, in the fire environment, nobody's an island. Nobody is, because once you see this over and over again, it's happened in any major conflagration, any big fire that's caused structure loss. Once one house ignites, you have a big problem. Then you have an urban, an urban conflagration or a WUI conflagration, or however you want to call that, and then that changes the structure and the dynamics of the fire.
Right, now the houses are the fuels.
And this presents a whole new problem, not to mention changes composition in of the smoke, increases the toxicity of the smoke and the soil afterwards, etc., etc. It's you really want to try and prevention is way better than suppression, and but it's hard. It's a difficult problem, especially in California. It's I think we talk a lot about clearing your brush and doing fuels management, but fuels management in California is a challenging issue. And I mean, we all understand that, right? I mean, I was in Florida. Florida do more prescribed fire, way more prescribed fire than any other state, but the fire regime is a little bit more conducive to being able to do that. California, you have smaller windows. There's more, let's say, anti prescribed fire sentiment and legislation in California. It's harder to do, even if the conditions are great. It's not necessarily easy to get fire on the ground, right? So, there's things that, but I like to think that, we're providing information that sort of allows people to almost like a sort of a second, like you can look out of your window and say, okay, well, I see lots of, tangled brush and looks like it will go up pretty quick. And so if our score is very high or if our risk is very high, then you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes, we don't have perfect data. Sometimes, it's a complicated problem. There's a lot of inputs. There's a lot of uncertainty in the input. There's uncertainty in the land fire fuels data set. You don't, it's not necessarily been ground truth everywhere. So it's not like you're walking around and you're saying, okay, in this 30-meter box, I'm, TU5.
I've seen Hassan Mahmoud's drone
Yes.
footage where
Yes.
we're literally, down to the automobile mapping the calorimetry value of everything that can be seen from the drone or from the street.
Right.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, no, this is I'm really, I think Hassan is he's doing some really great work, and his
we lost him from Colorado, and he's gone
yes,
to Vanderbilt now. But I had a question about fires that we haven't heard of. So, as a student of fire, obviously you would be familiar with things like San Francisco, Chicago, London, and more recently Lahaina, Palisades,
right.
Marshall, etc. Because these fires actually happened. When you're throwing darts at your dartboard to start hypothetical virtual fires, and then modeling the outcome, are there famous fires that never happened? These are famous, that within the academic community, there was some particular simulation that was run that was absolutely catastrophic. It just hasn't happened yet.
I think we don't all get together and pour over our model output and say, I've simulated a worse fire than you. But I think everybody, the goal, I mean, certainly in insurance, in the insurance world, in the risk, in the insurance, the goal of that approach and the goal of this model is to try and simulate, like, what's the worst scenario you could possibly imagine?
Mm-hmm.
And you hope that that's in your model. There's something like that is in your model. And so, I've certainly, in some of the simulations we've done, we look at we simulate the fire, then we run it down to the loss, the dollar loss per event for that simulated fire. And so it's always interesting then to look at like, what was my worst simulated fire? And it was, if I'm recalling, it was in the Bay Area. It was something that I think we'd simulated particularly high winds in the Bay Area, and it took out a lot of, I think it was like $50 billion hypothetical loss or something like this. It was, so you can see those, and
Yeah. This brings me another question, because you've done this, and I won't ask you to divulge what the ideal conditions were for this maximal loss because of this concept of pyroterrorism, right? If I know,
right,
if I know what's the best day to strike a match in this spot to create the
right,
most damage,
yeah,
then I can create an awful lot of vulnerability very
yeah,
inexpensively. And so, what are your
for sure,
thoughts on what's going on? We'd love to think that academic knowledge should be shared universally because we can learn from each other, etc.
yeah.
But it's very easy for this to, in the wrong hands, become
I
weaponized.
mean, no, it is, and it's
Yeah,
something that um, I think there's, I would say, a small group of people are thinking about it. I I know a handful of people in the insurance industry who think it's very important and that it's under estimated dramatically to our detriment, because you're absolutely right. It would be really quite easy for a relatively small number of bad actors to set a handful of fires. And we know from the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire that you can't rely on water pressure in municipal water supply, and it's not because there's not water there, it's just because of how it works.
right.
You can't rely on it. And in the same, if you have enough fires going, at some point you're going to, let's say, max out resources and as well. And so actually this was, we try to model these, not the terrorism side of things, but we try to model, incorporate into the model a sense of resource estimation and think of, and this is essentially what does happen in these particularly big models simulated the big loss fires. Is they're big loss because there is a number of events happening on the same day that are all straining resources, and more often than not, that's why fires cause the damage that they do. And yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely a concern, from a, let's say, sort of a eco-terrorism, if that's what you want to call it, perspective of, I think it's a big risk that I really do think we need to, somebody should be thinking about it more
Right.
than
I mean,
they
the
are.
Pentagon, they play war games about if this
Yeah,
country bombs that country. Well,
right.
what if, 10 idiots out in the Bay Area pick the right day I mean, they can, one idiot with a match can shut down Vandenberg Air Force Base for
Yeah.
months, right? So,
And obviously we have drones now too, so that you conceivably don't even need to be physically there.
which goes on both sides, right? You
Right,
can
right, right, right,
fight the fire without being there, and supposedly, eventually,
right,
you'll be able to suppress the fire without being there.
right, exactly. So I mean, I think it's definitely, it is a concern I have, and I know there are sort of a group of people who do think it's a pretty serious concern. It's hard to say. I don't know quite how to quantify that part of the risk. Like, well, I mean, there are terrorism risk models. Obviously, this is a thing that they do this in the government, and they try and quantify the risk of terrorism. And but my understanding is that they don't have low tech, sort of low or sort of simple things like, well, we have just one guy in a car driving along a highway throwing out flares every few miles from just sort of potentially, loads of them. So
Yeah.
it's hard to understand. I mean, I can quantify, it's easier to quantify the actual risk based on ignitions that are in the historical. We're based again. Our risk model is based on historical fires. And there are millions. Obviously, there are the fire occurrence database is has essentially every recorded fire, all the way down to things that just burn like a fraction of an acre and are put out in a couple of minutes, but they still make their way into and so that database does really capture the human element of fire. You can really if you look at the fire occurrence database, you can see the signature of the roads. There's just so many ignitions along the roads, and so there are a lot of elements to how fires start, and so it would capture it in some sense, but not in an intentional sense, right? So
so let's say you get a start, and you could predict, what that fire footprint's going to look like, and presumably that imprint or that footprint is impacted by the mitigation and suppression efforts. What do we know, dialing down at the fire level? What do we know about strategies and tactics and hardware that cause an ignition to have a lower dollar value price tag?
That's a harder one for me to answer, because we can incorporate sort of a suppression, and we built sort of a suppression sub-model, as it were, where and it's sort of based on simple ideas like, well, the higher the wind, the harder it is to fight a fire. The higher the flame length, the harder it is to fight a fire. The earlier it is to the ignition time, there's sort of a mobilization time. So the first half an hour, whatever is you can't necessarily assume that there's so we can incorporate things like that. It's much harder to incorporate sort of actual sort of suppression, because a lot of those are based on sort of tactics of the incident management and how that is going to work. I don't have a good sense of how to incorporate that into the model. This is where the human element gets very, very complicated, and we can think about it in broad terms. But one of the things that you could do, though, that we can do with the models is sort of a fuels management scenario idea, where we can take our fuels input, and we can say, well, we simulate a fire and it does this, but what happens if we remove a line of fuels in this pattern and the wind is doing, and this sort of
model and
right. So the model kind of lab in that sense allows us to run many, many different scenarios to try and get a sense of, what would be the most effective fuels treatment. Is it thinning, or is it just, doing big dozer lines or whatever? What's the most effective?
Do you define for the model where you're going to do fuel treatment, or do you teach the model how to play that game and let it play 100,000 fuel treatment options and tell you?
It would be possible to try and get the model to learn a little bit of that. At the moment, we think of it as more of a it's a bit more of a hands-on ad hoc sort of scenario tool. It's not something that is, let's say, built into the model. But if somebody says, well, can you tell me how my risk would change if we did this fuels management in our community, then we could do that as, let's say, sort of as an ad hoc type project. But that would be a really nice, ultimately that would be a really nice sort of thing to allow sort of users to do, as opposed part of that. I think the issue, and this is where modeling gets complicated, especially with the risk modeling, where you have a need to run many, many millions of events to get statistically significant answers, that if you want to change anything, you have to run those many millions of events all over again. And that takes a little bit of time. It's a little easier. There are some nice tools at the moment that you can use. There are some companies that are doing more real-time fire spread models. And they're tools you can do things like that because they're only really sort of concerned with, here's a fire, one fire right now. We'll simulate that. We might change the winds a bit, or we might change and you can do that in kind of close to real time if you're only thinking about sort of a single event, like an ongoing event, or maybe a handful of events if you're doing it, let's say, for all the fires currently in California or wherever it is. But when you're thinking about a risk model with even though an individual fire runs very fast, the whole event set of 10, 100 million fires can still take several days. So it's a little harder to manage that, but it's something that we're definitely thinking about, and we'd love to sort of build into the model, is how to help people understand how to mitigate, how to give them guidance for mitigation, as opposed to just, well, I'm just going to follow standard defensible space sort of firewise type things, which I think I'm a huge proponent of the work that Jack Cohen did at the Fire Lab. I think Jack's an amazing guy, and I've always been a strong sort of proponent of Jack's fundamental idea of, if you keep your house clear of things that are going to burn, the likelihood that your house will burn goes down. It's not rocket science. It's and I think there's this sort of often a misconception with fire, and I'm sure you run into this too, that here comes a fire and it's just this sort of this. I think people imagine that there's this wall of 30-foot flames coming towards us, for which there's absolutely no escape. And obviously, I wouldn't advocate standing in front of a fire front, but at the same time, you know that that's not quite how it works. It's very heterogeneous. It's intermittent. It goes but this way, or it goes, there's gaps, and the fire has runs, and it's spatially complex. And I think the idea of home hardening, sort of minimizing the amount of flammable material, 5 feet, 30 feet, clear your gutters, all these sorts of things that talk about. I mean, I know I'm the scientist, right? I'm not the home hardening guy. I'm not a mitigation specialist, but at the end of the day, I've been studying this for a long time, and it really does make a huge difference to your risk, to your house's risk, if you do even sort of the minimal effort, right? Even just sort of like some simple sort of clearing gutters and making sure there's no pine needles, and you have a good mesh on your sort of inlets, and all these sort of relatively, don't have a pile of firewood leaning up against your house. Those sorts of things, they're not complex.
A pile of empty Amazon boxes.
So yeah, I think it's and it sort of brings it around sort of nicely. I think that we can model the risk, and I think, but there's still a lot that, just because your house is very high risk in our model doesn't necessarily mean that actually on the ground it's that high risk. If you don't just have to say, wow, my house is 9 out of 10, that's it. If there's a fire, I'm done for. And there are things that you can do. And similarly, the other way, I think if your house has sort of a modeled, a relatively low risk, or you don't want to be complacent about that. I think you still need to sort of pay attention to, well, okay, that's fair, but there are things that I can still do. It would be, because I think often I've seen in sort of post-fire investigations, or in other sort of just colloquially things of, the fire will pass by a property and the property is, let's say, fine, unscathed, but there are little embers sort of smoldering, catching, whatever. And it's really I see this all the time of houses that they survived the fire front, but still get completely destroyed because there was just stuff around them that burned, and eventually, and again, I'm not, I wouldn't want to advocate for people staying at home in a wildfire. I still think it's, you should follow, obviously, evacuation orders, but there's a lot of properties that are lost that could have been saved either by simple mitigation before, or essentially just knocking down some embers as they start. And it's unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that because it's obviously safer to evacuate. So it's clear your brush.
There you go. Good final words there, Phil. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the wisdom that you've shared, and more so, the many years of your life you've devoted to improving safety for all of us. So thank you so much for that. And
I love working in fire. I think the wildfire community is fantastic. I haven't met a wildfire professional that I didn't get along with yet. And I think the wildfire community is very across the whole, all the way from us, sitting behind computers, science, erudite types, all the way to people working actually on fires, and the hotshot crews and the firefighters and people flying the aircraft, etc. I mean, I think it's just it's a community, I think, that has a good understanding of how everybody is sort of trying to do their best to help.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're sort of fighting some external factors, but at the same time, I think everybody is. So I appreciate it. I really appreciate you inviting me. I've had a wonderful time chatting away, and I love to all the rest of my friends in the wildfire world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Phil Cunningham with First Street Wildfire Modeler Extraordinaire. Thanks so much for joining us. You've been listening to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Till I see you next time, as Phil Cunningham said, clear your brush.